Hey everyone, this is Zach with 8020 Media, here today with a video on the most common BMW N63 engine problems. The N63 is a little bit of a complicated engine to get started with here and dive into all these problems. It's been in production since 2008 and remains in production as of 2023. So of course, with that 15-year span, there have been quite a few changes and updates to the N63 over the years. It's actually on its third technical update now, so essentially the fourth iteration of the N63. So again, lots of updates and lots of changes for the 4.4-liter twin-turbo V8 over the years. And again, it's a very different engine today than what it was back in 2008. And so as we move through these common problems, we'll go a little bit more in depth, discuss which problems affect which years and which generations of the N63, and then in the summary, wrap that all up and talk about the different generations and what that means for reliability overall for all of these. One thing to knock off right off the bat with the N63 is the very first iteration of the N63 from 2008 until 2013. It actually ended production in most models around June of 2012. That was a very unreliable engine and possibly the most unreliable engine that we've ever filmed a YouTube video on. Quite a few things to roll through with the N63 here. BMW even came out with a customer care package for these initial N63 variants and all the various problems they had. So really most of what we discuss here will be issues on that first iteration, the original N63 from 2008 until again about mid-2012. And then we have a couple issues here that extended a little bit beyond that, as well as some that are current and can be expected even on the newest 2023 plus N63s. But anyway, we'll mention that and throw in a couple more notes on that throughout the video, and then again in the summary. Jumping right into common problems, number one, we have excess oil consumption on the N63. So the N63 is a hot V design, which means the turbochargers and exhaust manifolds are actually housed in the V of the engine. When you think about a V8, the manifolds and the turbochargers are placed right in the middle of that V of the engine, whereas typically they would be placed on the outside of the engine. So the biggest flaw with that hot V design is right in the V of the engine. There's just so much built up heat from those turbochargers, from that exhaust manifold. And that's really one of the things that causes a lot of the issues with the N63. It's still that same hot V design as of now, so it's not a total failure of a design. BMW obviously continued using that for a reason. Ultimately, excess oil consumption is one downside to that hot V design. There's a lot of heat in there, and so there's more engine oil just being burned off from that design and from all of the heat that's trapped in the V of the engine. In terms of excess oil consumption, BMW claims 1 quart for every 1,000 miles is normal, but a lot of owners have reported going through a quart every 500, 600 miles, so that's pretty aggressive oil consumption. One way to mitigate this, if you have high oil consumption on the N63, is just stick with more frequent oil changes. Keep spare oil around with you in your garage, keep it in the trunk of the car, keep it wherever it's easily accessible in case you do need to top up on a quart or two of oil here and there. A little bit of a downside to owning the N63, but again, keeping a little oil around, this doesn't really cause any serious long-term concerns or issues. Just a little more expense with having to top up the oil a bit more frequently. BMW recommends changing the oil every 10,000 miles, which is pretty long for the N63. Cutting that down to about 4,000 to 6,000 miles should help, at least in ensuring that that oil is topped up and always full. Moving on to number two for common N63 engine problems, we have fuel injector and high pressure fuel pump failures. Just like the N54, for those of you who are familiar with BMW engines, and especially these modern turbocharged BMW engines, the N54 obviously doesn't have a great reputation for reliability. Unfortunately, the N63 is even worse in some categories, and like the N54, suffered from these injector and high-pressure fuel pump issues. Both engines use piezoelectric direct injectors, which unfortunately are very expensive. I believe nowadays each injector is somewhere in the ballpark of $400 to $500 per injector. So if you run into those issues on the V8 and have to replace multiple injectors, Obviously, that adds up very quickly. Now, the high-pressure fuel pump was mostly problematic on the BMW N54. The N63 does actually have a different high-pressure fuel pump design that was a little less problematic, especially in the early days, but it's still a known failure point for the N63 and something to still be on the lookout for and be aware of. Something that took BMW a while to finally fix. Fortunately, if you look at models outside of the original N63, it's mostly resolved. You might still run into the occasional fluky fuel injector failures, but not something that we would classify a common problem on 2013 plus engines with the technical update. Moving on to our third problem on the list, and this is another thing that primarily affects those original 2008 to mid-2012 engines, and that's timing chain failure. Really, that just boils down to a poor timing chain design. It stretches over time. After the timing chain stretches enough, you will eventually jump timing, and depending on how severe it is, you could cause a lot of additional damage to the N63. It is an interference engine, so if the timing jumps enough, that will allow intake and exhaust valves to collide with the pistons, which obviously that is a recipe for disaster. You could end up bending rods, cracking pistons, doing a lot more damage, and so if it's bad enough, that could lead to complete engine failure and a complete rebuild or replacement of the N63. Now, it's not that common that an issue that severe happens. Usually when the timing does jump, it's small enough that it's not a huge deal. You'll just have a very poor running car. You can go get the timing chain fixed and you should be good to go. But again, in the severe cases, it can turn into a very costly and very severe issue. So this was resolved on the N63 TU, that first technical update coming out in mid-2012. So not much of a concern for newer models. The occasional fluky failures can and do happen, but not anything that should be classified as a truly common issue with the N63 on the newer ones. Number 4 on the list, we have leaking valve stem seals, which is an issue that even the previous naturally aspirated N62 had some issues with, and that carried over to the N63, unfortunately. Some things to look out for with valve stem seal issues would be excess white smoke from the exhaust. Usually if the stem seals are just on their way out, it won't be that noticeable, but once the failure progresses, you'll notice quite a bit of white smoke coming out of the exhaust. This also ties into excess oil consumption. As that oil is allowed to pass through the valve stem seals, you'll notice a lot more oil consumption, so be on the lookout for that. If you do have excess oil consumption, definitely look for the white smoke from the exhaust, and if you have those two things in combination, then there's a good chance you have some valve stem seal issues. The main downside with the valve stem seals, the kit to repair all of the seals is only about $60, relatively inexpensive, but the labor is the real killer on this job, and that's where you can end up spending $2,000, $3,000 plus on labor. So cheap part, just incredibly challenging to replace. If you're not an experienced or advanced mechanic or DIYer, then it's probably not something that you should attempt or try to get involved in. So this was mostly fixed on the N63 TU in 2012. However, that still wasn't a complete foolproof solution, since BMW did come back and again update the valve stem seal design with the third technical update, which occurred in 2018. So there were still some failures going on between then. It seems like on the newest 2018 plus third technical update that the issues have mostly been resolved as of now. Of course, that was only about 5 years ago, so time will tell if more and more issues keep popping up, but for the most part, it shouldn't be a big concern from 2013 to 2018 models. And looking at 2018 plus, the concern should be very minimal at best. But again, on those original N63s, that was a major problem that was very expensive to fix. Moving on to number 5, just a couple general issues with the N63: oil and coolant leaks. With that hot V design, there's just so much heat built up in the V of the engine. So valve cover gasket leaks are common. That's something that happens on a lot of different BMW engines, not just the N63. Main seals, the front and rear main seals, those don't leak too commonly, but it does happen. Oil pan gaskets, another common leak on the N63. And otherwise, when it comes to cooling system issues, coolant leaks, cracked coolant hoses, pipes, radiator issues, water pump issues, especially on the earlier N63 engines, again, all somewhat common problems among many different BMW engines and not just the N63. So when it comes to oil and coolant leaks and cooling system problems, that's something to be aware of on pretty much any year and model of the N63. If you have a newer one, they're certainly a lot less common, especially looking at the 2018 plus. the engine's come a long way and is a shell of its former self. It's a very different engine and much more reliable. So ultimately, that wraps up most of our problems for the N63. To summarize with a couple notes here, BMW did come out with that customer care package for the original N63 engines as a way to help with repair costs and rectify the situation a little bit and try to improve their reputation, since the N63 really was quite the horror story early on, with a lot of different lawsuits, a lot of different issues, just a lot going on with it. The original N63s just had so many various problems, so many expensive issues, spent so much time in the shop. The modern N63 is very different. Pretty much the entire engine has been redesigned. All of the major components have been redesigned. The only things that are really shared in common are the N63 engine block and sharing the same 4.4 liter displacement, along with the twin turbocharged direct injected design. But otherwise, so much has changed with the N63, it's impossible to cover it all in this video. With 3 technical updates, each one of those were pretty major, and especially with the original technical update that was mostly aimed at solving the issues with the original N63, the N63 TU and TU3 still tried to improve on reliability in a couple aspects, but at that point the N63 was in a pretty good place, so most of the newer updates, especially looking at the 3rd technical update, was more so about power, performance, emissions, and that kind of stuff, rather than necessarily trying to fix any ongoing reliability issues. So ultimately, the N63 is a bit of a tough engine to put a reliability rating on. If you look at those older 2008 to mid-2012 examples, that's a pretty unreliable engine and debatably one of the most unreliable BMW engines of all time and one of the more unreliable engines probably in the world. There are certainly worse examples out there, but the N63 was pretty poor early on. Looking at it since then, the N63 has improved drastically, and now it's something to expect in the mid-tier in terms of reliability. It is a high-performance V8 engine, twin turbocharged, in a BMW, and so naturally repair and maintenance costs are going to be higher than your average car and your average engine. However, it doesn't suffer from a ton of major issues. It's just that when those problems do come up, expect the repair bills to be higher and costlier than what you'd expect on a typical car or engine. If you guys like this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the description below for more awesome content on the BMW N63. Thanks, guys.